We will take you to the time of Islam's earliest links to the continent of Africa, a place at the edge of the Sahara Desert where an important global legacy was uncovered: West Africa's literate culture. Over 1 million manuscripts in Mali alone reveal that a sophisticated, well educated society flourished in the city of Timbuktu from the 13th to the 19th century. Come with us to Timbuktu, a city that has captured the imagination of the world for its richness as a crossroads of international caravan trade. You will learn of a time when West Africa controlled the world's gold export. As a result of this prosperity, the great empires of West Africa developed and prospered. You will meet noble leaders from across the centuries who left a living heritage that is recognized worldwide. From centuries old manuscripts, you will discover lessons that have universal meaning for us today: the importance of education, women's rights, human rights, peace, tolerance, and perhaps most significant, the value of conflict resolution between individuals, within families, in communities, across religious differences, and among nations of the world. Come with us to Timbuktu in Mali, West Africa. Before Europe emerged from the Middle Ages into the Renaissance, a cultural and intellectual phenomenon was flourishing on another continent. As Islam spread from Arabia across East and North Africa to Spain and Portugal in the 8th century, Islamic literacy and artistic expression reached sub-Saharan Africa. Timbuktu's legacy is a blend of this great heritage of African and Islamic cultures. At the height of its prominence, Timbuktu was a renowned center of Islamic teachings and broad based learning that lasted almost 300 years. The city was an educational hub that included the Sankore Mosque and University, two other universities with large libraries, private libraries, and 150 schools. Books were not only brought into Timbuktu, but local scholars authored their own books, and artisans scribed, decorated, and bound them in a sophisticated local book production industry. Three of the city's mosques that were a part of the great education system survive today. They are recognized by UNESCO as World Heritage Sites in danger. As the desert encroaches on Timbuktu, time and weather have taken their toll on these remarkable architectural wonders. But they remain enduring symbols of a period of great enlightenment and African Islamic teachings and traditions. Today, in Timbuktu, as in the Middle Ages, education is paramount. Muslim children attend Quranic schools, learn Arabic and Islamic studies using wooden tablets that recall the past. They also study a broad range of academic subjects. Although the curriculum does not reflect the Islamic scholarship or afford them the opportunity to benefit from the past knowledge. Timbuktu and the entire region of Central and West Africa fell into decline in the late 16th century from internal as well as external forces, such as the Moroccan invasion and the French colonization. One of the most ravaging events, however, was the transatlantic slave trade, during which millions of Africans were captured, sold into slavery, and transported to the New World. Among them were leaders and scholars from Timbuktu and many other Muslims. Some of their stories about how they kept their way of life in America have come to us from valuable records they left. Another devastating impact was European colonial rule in Africa, beginning in the 1880s. Timbuktu and its region, which would become the country of Mali, was a
Good evening. My name is Mina Marcana. I'm the General Director of the Spoleto Festival USA. Thank you for joining us in our first installment of our ongoing discussion series for this year called More on That Now. Similar to its predecessor, Exploring Omar, More on That Now will touch on a wide range of themes like culture, education, citizenship, justice, and equity, and explore their intersections with art and our upcoming 2022 festival. Just last month, we announced this season's opera programming, including two world premieres, Omar and Unholy Wars, and a unique restaging of La Boheme. The entirety of our season will be announced in February. Um, but for tonight, I'm thrilled to introduce More on That Now's moderator, Dr. Hussein Rashid, a lecturer at the New School in New York. He's been featured on NPR, CNN, and in the New York Times and Washington Post. His research and writing focuses on Muslims and American pop culture, including music, comics, movies, and more. And throughout the series, he will be enjoyed by other thought leaders from universities, religious institutions, the media, and the stage. Tonight's discussion, which, by the way, was pre-recorded to accommodate a panelist who was called to present before the United Nations, is a continuation of those surrounding Omar. Yet we will be introduced to new further narratives. Panelists will share histories and faiths of several people like Omar Ibn Said, who were Muslims from West Africa and enslaved in the United States. The talk will also examine thoughts on pluralism and patriarchy. And for me, it's a fascinating kickoff to our series, and I really hope you enjoy listening. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this evening's conversation around autobiography, biography, and discovering the history of literate Muslims in the United States. We want to thank the Spoleto Festival for hosting us this evening, Ms. Letitia Smith, who's the Community Engagement Coordinator, who's joining us and will be with us for this conversation. The story of West African Muslims in the United States does not begin or end with Omar Ibn Said. While Said's biography shares a remarkable firsthand account, the enslaved Muslim experience in America was not monolithic. During this talk, panelists will discuss the lives and religion of several enslaved African Muslims, such as Ibrahima Rahman and Ayuba Suleiman Diallo, both princes in their homelands, and Salih Bilali and Mohammed, who worshipped along Georgia's coastal islands. Discover these figures shared in disparate histories, cultural practices, and legacies left behind. Our panelists this evening are Okolo Rashid, the president and co-founder of the International Museum of Muslim Cultures, America's first Muslim museum, which opened in Jackson, Mississippi in April 2001. In January 2004, Okolo and her husband Sababu traveled to Mali, West Africa, where they negotiated a partnership with the Mama Hadera Memorial Library of Timbuktu to bring back ancient African manuscripts, establishing West African literacy and scholarship dating back to the 9th century. Dr. Mohammed Fraser-Rahim is an assistant professor at the Citadel, the Military College of South Carolina, and a visiting assistant professor at Yale University. He's the author of America's Other Muslims, Imam W.D. Muhammad, Islamic Reform, and the Making of American Islam, published in 2020, and is finishing up a manuscript on Low Country enslaved Muslims. Thank you all for joining us this evening, both our panelists and the community. I think one of the things that I'd like us to begin discussing this evening is, in our introduction, we're talking a lot about male literate Muslim figures. And I think one of the things that we have to be responsible for is discussing why enslaved Muslim women were not part of this description. Where are women's narratives in this historical record? And Okolo, maybe if you don't mind starting us off on that question. You're on mute, Okolo.
So sorry. Yes, I am really grateful to be here. Thanks to Ms. Letitia Smith and Spoleto for having us. I don't know exactly why there aren't any historical narratives on enslaved African women or African-American women. But I can say that with the work that we do and the research that we've done through the museum and our scholars working in West Africa, Timbuktu and other places, we found that, number one, that women scholars during the early, that period of scholarship and great, wealth and empire building was women were actually writing in their husbands' names. So we were able to discover that. And so let's say, when women came over here to this country, maybe, somehow, we had an early history of that as well in America. But I would just really like to at least introduce a great scholar, activist, and she was really an advisor to her father and her brother. That's Nana Usmahu. She was in early 17th century up through the 20th century. Her scholarship is recognized for having wrote about, her relationship with her father, who is Uthman Danfodio, the great jihadist Islamic scholar and leader at that time. So there is a scholar in this country, Dr. Beverly Mack, the University of Kentucky, that actually published her works. That was in 2020. And so we actually was able to host her. And so she really talked about it's an extraordinary collection of scholarship, poetry, and somewhat the life of Nana Usmahu. And her work was really going through the region, organizing women and educating women and teaching women to be social activists in their communities. So I guess my last point about that is that, and after Beverly's and her partner Jean Boyd, those were the two authors for that collection of Usmahu's work. But after that, there were women that came from the Nigerian. This was in southern Nigeria, where Nana Usmahu had lived and really did a lot of that work. They in the United States, they did decide to actually collect her works and began to establish a Qadiri community that would actually revive her works and so forth and so on. And so that is happening, and that they are women in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So that work continues today.
Mohammed, do you have any thoughts about women's narratives from this time period? Why we have so many male narratives or narratives from men, but not from women?
Yeah, I think, this has come up quite a bit in terms of the predominance of male literature that we have now come available and we've discovered. One body of work that I really enjoyed came out last year is Far From Mecca by Aliyah Hussain, who teaches at the University of Michigan, and she looks at essentially Muslims in the Caribbean and this same conundrum or same predicament, if you will, that those who are in the Americas, and particularly North America, struggle to find out and reverse engineer, if you will, these narratives, these stories of these individuals. And I think, as our colleague mentioned, I think that what we see is, I think in time, we're going to see a lot more information come available. I can tell you that, both as a native of Charleston, South Carolina, someone who studied as a young man in West Africa, that, I remember asking these questions, looking and discovering. I mean, the discovery of Omar Ibn Said's text, as we know, was largely by twofold: one by happenstance, slash by right time at the right moment. And so what I would encourage those young researchers on this call, I always like to point to the next generation. Listen, talk to those older generations, talk to family members who might not be comfortable in sharing their stories and histories, because more than likely there might be an account that's written down, and it might not be all in one sort of singular form like we had the works of Omar Ibn Said, but they might be a collection of body of narratives, of stories that we can then piece together. And then as historians, as researchers, what we try to do is then piece together what we think is sort of that puzzle. I mean, so yes, I think that that there has been this, again, as I started, this predominance of largely male, but I'm confident that there might be more out there, actually, just by sheer research skills. And one of my teachers, the late Dr. Suleiman Yang, who used to always say, there's probably more out there, we've just scratched the surface. And so I think in that spirit, I think that yes, there's been this proclivity toward men, but there's a rich tradition, certainly in West Africa, and don't forget too as well, we have Brazil, we have all of throughout Latin America too as well, that offers a whole sort of a canvas, if you will, of site visits and research as well.
Thank you. I just want to push this question a little bit further, because I'm curious if some social structures also may have had an influence on this. So what do I mean by this? I think, Mohammed, building on your point that these sources may be out there, right? If we look at some of the oral histories that were captured by the WPA, where we have a lot of knowledge of enslaved Muslims, right? People talking about their grandparents or their great uncles and describing them, if perhaps not as Muslim, but describing actions that we then as readers identify as Muslim. There's a lot of grandmothers, there's a lot of aunts. So we know that there were Muslim women here. And I think makes it possible for us to say, yes, what are these other sources? Like, is there a written record? And so I think there's something there. But I also think about the social context. And what I mean by that is, when we think about this trafficking of human beings, right? There's a preference that's given to men, right? They're coming over. We know this from the record. So is it also a question of the demographics of who's being enslaved and brought over? Is it a question of whose stories we think are important? Yes, Omar Ibn Said is as you said, happenstance. But when we look at Diallo or Abu Rahman, there's also, they were princes, right? And these were men who had stories to tell, who were recognized in their lifetimes. Women maybe didn't have that same privilege. Women weren't seen as having stories to tell. And I'm just curious, and maybe we don't have enough data at this, but I'd just love to hear what your thoughts are about this, and maybe what some of the social structures where that had an impact on this.
I did a panel about 2 years ago at the, actually longer now, COVID times. It's hard to get the bearings of the years, but I was down in the University of Mississippi, and one of the conversation in the paper that I put together was on food patterns and religious diversity in the Low Country, and essentially it was in the American South, but I focused on the Low Country of South Carolina and Georgia. So I'm a trained historian. I use historiography as my sort of tools to engage this work. Religious studies scholars will engage it a certain way, anthropologists, et cetera. But I think if we look at this in a sort of broad interdisciplinary approach, then we might be able to then look at, okay, the patterns of food in which jollof rice, red rice, we look at the different food consumption, and we look at different ways of how individuals who were involved in those X, Y, and Z skills, technical skills at best too as well, that we might be able to piece together some women who, again, those accounts, those logs, who were doing errand runs. I can tell you new research project I'm doing, individuals who, a runaway slave who was in Charleston off of King Street, who was a part of the vaudeville show, who was passing through Charleston, who happened to be Mohammed. So again, I'm still working on this, but I'd be curious to say, if he was there, who was with him? Was he given a pass to leave, and who accompanied him on that journey? And I think that speaks to what I think you're getting at, is how are we piecing together this very complex stories that are sometimes using the oral word and traditions, and how are those passed along, and that we don't take them as simply hearsay or old tales, but how are we distinguishing between sort of historical fact and then also piecing together these rich traditions that can help us and aid us. Last thing I think, which is a tough conversation, I think, the tradition of the Black church is just as important to the story of the enslaved African Muslim experience, because the Black church also doesn't come out of isolation. There had to have been individuals who became members of the AME church or became Baptists, but they can perhaps remember family members who could have followed, as we see various narratives, the Mohammedan way or facing Mecca. And there are a number of stories and accounts. When I worked on the DC archaeological project, where we were looking for the grave and looking for Yar Mahmud, we were looking and discovering this. And part of that, we found that, one of the rich, longest standing African-American churches happens to be in Georgetown, Washington, D.C. And there are a number of accounts where there are individuals whose family members, and not just there, elsewhere, whose family members, whose grandfathers had Muslim names. Now, the question is, were they practicing Muslim? Well, if they were with a Muslim name and being that close and separated from the old world, coming from West Africa, more than likely, they were still adopting the religion of Islam. And so the question is, how does that pass on to that generation? And then what happened when, X, Y, and Z family member then decided to take the pathway of a new faith, particularly within the Black church, which goes into some very difficult conversations of theology and how people have reconciled this, because it's not always easy when people have adopted this faith for so long, and then there's a new one that's come about too as well. So I really like your question, because I think these are deeper, more existential questions within Black communities and African-American communities as well, because it really does some deep soul searching, and how truly, when we talk about religious diversity and religious pluralism.
Well, I guess I'd like to just add that the social structure that we really have to look at in this country is patriarchy, and the fact that that was really the way that we responded to the social interactions and so forth. However, I want us to, I think, even though we're focusing a lot on the American Muslim story and history, I think we have to look back at West Africa and Muslims, African Muslims before they were brought over to this country, because the social structure was very different in Africa, in West Africa. And Islam really spread very differently in West Africa because women were in leadership roles before Islam was embraced by West Africans. And so women continue to be in leadership roles. So there were women scholars, as I use that example of Nana Usmahu, but one of the enslaved Africans, Alan Austin, also did a book similar to Dr. Simeon Juice's book. His was West Africans Enslaved in America. And hers, that was, I think, West Africans enslaved in the, no, I think his was in antebellum America. I'm getting them a little mixed up, but he tells the story of one of the enslaved Africans that talked about him being taught by his sister, right, who was a scholar and a teacher, and many men being taught by women scholars in West Africa. So somehow, because of the patriarchy, I would say, men's stories became more important and that they were sought out as opposed to women's stories.
Thank you again, both for that. And I think you both opened up a conversation about this context in which we are meeting these historical figures. Okolo, you're pointing us to their West African roots. Mohammed, you're inviting us to think in a multidisciplinary perspective. And Mohammed, I'm going to ask you to start with this because you've hinted at this a little bit more. But thinking through, what are some of the mechanisms through which we can recover these histories? So you've talked about foodways, you've talked about these tales that maybe aren't being written, but this oral history, right? Oral transmission of knowledge. But we also have other records, right? So for example, we know George Washington on his plantations enslaved two women, both named Fatima, right? Which tells us that they were most likely Muslim, right? And so we have these other sources of records. Where do we start looking? If we're pointing to the next generation or we're looking at interested people, I'm finding, and I'm sure both of you have seen this as well, in manuscripts, in newspaper ads for runaway slaves, which you've talked about, Mama, that he would stop, or she would stop in some cases, which I think is interesting as well, would stop and pray towards the sun, which we take as being oriented towards Mecca, so again, we have these little clues here and there. So what are some of these other sources we can tell people to start looking at? How do we socialize them for this?
Stories, songs, grave sites, just three right there, right? Stories that we tell, or songs, let's just use songs that are told, that are passed from generation to generation. What's developed as Gullah Geechee stories, in many respects could be that diversity of both African traditional religions and Islam, that just sometimes by the lack of just the research just hasn't been unpacked, just kind of gets broad brushed as these are just songs. But musicologists, I mean, as Okolo mentioned, that Dr. Suleiman has talked about the impact of music and blues and jazz, et cetera, in particular, and how they have similar parallel in terms of how they conjure up certain intonations or at different levels. Obviously, the blues itself, we know that if we, in a lot of Arabic traditions and maqams, right, they get to various stations of using the human voice. Certainly within West Africa, this is no exception as well. And so what I think what you're offering, which is exciting, is we have more work to do. That there's a whole body of research to be unpacked. How about paintings, right? There's the beautiful, if you have it, the coloring book that was done by Jonathan Green, excuse me, and he used different color themes. We know that also within a long tradition of West African Islamic tradition, regardless of the spiritual pathway, particularly within Sufism, colors have meaning, numbers have meaning, and they have both obviously an apparent visible and then also a deeper esoteric knowledge and expression too as well. And so I would just, I think that what you're offering us as food for thought is this additional sort of pathway to really try to triangulate, if you will, these narratives and piece together. It requires not just going to the archives, but it is going to other locations to be able to see how we can piece this together. And that part is difficult. I think it's okay to say that. It's okay to acknowledge the difficulty to be able to do this, because it would be nice if a manuscript's right there and then we can glean information and then translate. And you know, the work of Al-Rayz, who's done a phenomenal work on translating another perspective from his background as a scholar of English literature, offers another narrative how we look at this that was very different than what Austin brought, or what Sylvian Juve or Suleiman Yang or Gomez, et cetera. And so I think we're all bringing these additional angles to try to get to a very deeper question. Who are these individuals? And what have we missed that can be impact so much more?
I guess my just brief comment would be that we should start with some of the historical resources that we have, like the Timbuktu manuscripts, you know, that were recently rediscovered in the last millennium. And of course, we have that collection of manuscripts, and we're working with those scholars that are translating and doing all the conservation work. But one of our scholars talks about the fact that looking back at these manuscripts to get a better understanding of what existed prior to, you know, African coming over, that's men and women, it really offers us a unique American historical consciousness. It's a contribution to America's consciousness. And I think that unless we kind of unpack that to kind of utilize that as a way, as a trail to kind of then begin to try to utilize the research, because I get a little concerned when we talk about oral traditions and those kinds of things. I think they're great, but I think that this whole idea of Africa's great scholarship, you know, and great wealth and empire building around, you know, this culture of scholarship is something that we don't hear and we don't know about. And if we would build on that foundation to do that research that we're talking about and trying to maybe track it from as much as we can discover, like that example that I gave you that Alan Austin talked about this, you know, I can find that particular enslaved African, but I just don't have it in my head right now. But where he talked about this person talking about his sister being a scholar and really and a teacher and so forth. So if we can kind of utilize that trail to help us, that would be, to me, a great place to start.
Thank you, Okolo. I want to echo and lift up something you said and then ask you to dive deeper into something. So as you talk about this history of scholarship and these texts and this learning that is part of this heritage of people who are brought over to what will become the United States, I think it's important just to make explicit why we prefer the term enslaved over the term slave, because nobody's born a slave. They're made that way. It's a relational aspect. And if they are enslaved, what is that history and that heritage that is lost or taken away as part of that as part of that process? And I think it's an important thing to mention that even that shift in language opens up all these other possibilities for us to understand who are these people we're talking about. But we're also emphasizing here individuals. And I think what both you and Mohammed are offering us is these are individuals and we have their histories, but they're also part of community, and they're coming with this heritage and this history, communal heritage and history. It's being passed down communally. And so what is the community that the people who, when they are coming to the United States, how are they maintaining community or remaking community? How does that happen? Where does that come in? Into their narratives, into their stories, what we understand of these people who were brought over in this time period?
That's a very interesting question because, I would say that the whole, program of the U.S. government and this system really was to disrupt, and it was not about cultivating and allowing to exist that community. I'll just say that African historical community, and allowing them to cultivate those kinds of family relationships and community relationships. So I don't really think that, I know that there's work out there that talks about some of those, pieces of lifestyles that existed. Of their capture, were separated. If they could find two people that spoke the same language, they were separated. So that's a reality. However, once those people were brought here to this country, and this whole thing about slaves as opposed to enslaved, of course, I think you really explained it. And that is that the idea is that people are born free, but you can enslave a people, but people are not born as slaves, right? And so, I guess my final point is that I don't really. What we find is the research that's out there. There has to be more research, and that's a big part of what we plan to do. In addition to having the museum, we actually have established an Islamic Thought Institute to really do that kind of work, to really go back and begin to uncover, rediscover, that history and those kinds of things, not just for West Africa, but that needs to rediscover some of their connections and so forth. But my point is that is a work that has not been done. We start to talk about how recently, really, beginning to talk about in the 20th century, pretty much, the enslaved African Muslims who were scholars and had great universities and great wealth and empire building. One of the wealthiest persons in the world, according to the Huffington Post, was Buffett and all of the others, but that is really critically important research that we've got to do, and it's we don't have enough, scholars and work in that field, and that's what has to happen.
Mohammed, do you have any thoughts on community making?
I think the issue of community making in particular, as individuals leave their homeland, purpose, in light of the heinous conditions and vicious conditions of being enslaved Africans. And so, as our colleague mentioned, I think that this desire in particular to try to find and piece together these communities and develop a sort of new American consciousness or ethos, and the struggle and the challenge is what we're seeing develop even now in the 21st century and beyond. And I think that legacy is one in which we're all trying to understand. I mean, and I say that really thinking as I'm talking, because what I've realized is I think that there is this, Islamic studies is doing one thing, African studies is doing another, and it's in role in which these individuals have played, and also the importance of memory, and the importance of memory within communities themselves too as well. Unfortunately, visited many times Sapelo Island even as a young child growing up in Charleston, and that memory is shifted. The memory of those communities, the imagination, the stories that we are familiar with, Daughters of the Dusk, etc. Those stories they're great narratives. I remember the actor who played the call to prayer, the muezzin in Arabic. This narrative, I loved how she was able to piece it all together. But again, that memory has been slowly dissipating. Gentrification, land grab resources in these island nations, the inequality of, or I should say, heirs property, the inequality of access to capital. And so then we add that on top of the difficulty of trying to remember these stories. It becomes very challenging. And why it's that much more important to continue to try to figure out what we have at present, and also where we need to go at.
Thank you. Mohammed, every time you start talking about these oral stories and these oral histories and the examples you give, and intentionally or not, but it reminds me of the work of Toni Morrison in Song of Solomon, right? We see at least for me, it feels like there's a way in which these oral histories are given legitimacy and elevated once they're turned into the written word. Or Daughters of the Dust, which I think does something similar, but I think, again, Morrison's work, by virtue of being printed, by being written, brings it to a different sort of cultural resonance. More an observation than a question, but it's just something that every time you've been mentioning the oral history and the examples you give, it just keeps flashing that in front of me and coming into my mind.
Well, you make me think about, and I mentioned this in a previous iteration of this Spoleto discussion series, but you look at the work of Solomon Northrup in 12 Years a Slave, and of course Hollywood sort of amplified and leaves a bit of hazy historical records, etc. But what I do appreciate is in both the body of work, the written, and also the movie, because people learn differently. There was this scene of the reference of both, Patsy falls in the pig pen and falls to the ground, and the and so I think about hearing that. And so this it's interesting, these pop culture ideas, right? That song is well over, maybe close to 100 years old now, right? And the work of Solomon Northup as well, that these oral stories, right, that are told, and that someone might not know exactly what that is, but they're hearing it being passed from generation to generation. And I think that's beyond my focus, but I'm fascinated to see what we can glean from that, because again, scratching the surface on what that means, and ultimately, as Okolo mentioned too as well, the connection back to that the West African tradition as well. I don't think that there's a coincidence. I happen to have in front of me right here. This happens to be a qasida of Sheikh Mustafa Gi Haider, who is the grand uncle, of the leader of a Sufi tariqa that's in, or order, that's in South Carolina, established by Sheikh Harun Faye. Now, I know Sheikh Harun Faye as a young child growing up in Charleston, who comes to Charleston, who's from Senegal. So the question, right, he's from Futa Toro, he's from West Africa, studied Ibrahima Abdurrahman, Solomon bin Ayub bin Solomon, etc. Many different, Omar Ibn Said, clearly hailing from West Africa. And here we have, essentially in the mid 80s, early 90s, Harun Faye arrives in Charleston and doing a bit of a full reversal, and brings with him what would almost be classified as sort of a modern day tariqa that develops out of the Tijaniya, the Qadiriya order, right? He receives inspiration, establishes it into the West. And so here, this sort of full circle Africa connection, right? Enslaved Africans coming over to the New World. This second wave of, or the gap between enslaved African Muslims, or I should say enslaved Africans coming over to the New World, and then proto-Islamic or Islamic hybrid movements. Sheikh Harun comes and brings this Sufi Islam into the Americas, in particular, into the Carolinas. And bringing with him the liturgy, and bringing with him the knowledge of many of the practices that many of these personalities we've mentioned. So is it coincidence or not? Not quite sure, right? But it's very interesting that in the location in which we're talking about, memory, of stories, of conversion or reversion, you have new communities that are popping up that are very transnational in nature, that have individuals making pilgrimage back to West Africa, and converts and reverts, etc. And I think that that's an interesting story on top of these rich legacies of the past, and how they also move in the present.
Okolo, did you want to add anything?
Well, I guess we're at the museum. One of our scholars talked about the fact that we create these robust, programs and ways of telling the story around our exhibitions. And so he talks about the fact that the museum is kind of what we've done, and other museums are doing it now, but we use history as a historical mobilizer, for effecting change in the contemporary world. And so, and having said that, I think the most significant story, the news breaking story, is that West Africa had great scholarship, had great universities, had great wealth and empire building. That's the story. A lot of that has been lost with the American Muslims, African Muslims that were brought over. We've lost most of that history. We can take and spend a lot of our time seeking to rediscover those things, looking for bits and pieces. But I think if we would just, our position through the museum is to focus on the most significant piece, and that is that these were Muslims. They embraced this universal idea of Islam and Islamic scholarship, which was brought over into the West through Spain and Portugal, and sparked the Renaissance. So to build on that foundation, for us as African Americans now, looking at that history, we have to take what we can use best and build from that. And our position is that that is the greatest story, the effect of literacy and cultural pluralism. That's what the Timbuktu manuscripts and that collection kind of gives us a sense that it broadens us from just thinking about the African people, right? And African Muslims being brought over here, but what did they contribute? What did they leave as a legacy for us to build upon? And it is our position that that is the most powerful story, is that they left a legacy of great literacy, scholarship, wealth, and empire building that really gives us a new lens as African American, Muslims and America in general to look through, where successful communities were possible, right? Literacy, education, scholarship was possible. And that's what our young people need, as well as our older people in the African-American community. But those that are not African-Americans, they need to understand that story, that connection, so that African-Americans and our struggle for freedom, dignity can be realized and respected.
Thank you. I want to pick up this term that you've used, Okolo, of pluralism, because I've obviously been focusing a lot on the Muslim experience, coming at this through the lens of Omar Ibn Said. But Mohammed, you've also been very careful to make sure that the conversations we're having are not limited to religion, because a lot of the cultural structures, a lot of the impact, as I understand your comments, are not just impacting enslaved Muslims, they're impacting all enslaved peoples. And I think, and you said this explicitly, and I want to highlight this, is that you have also these communities, even to the level of family, that have multiple religions as part of that family. And so thinking about pluralism and how that works together, I think opens up two avenues of exploration for me. The first is, how are different religions getting along amongst enslaved communities? How are they interacting? And I think Okolo's already started getting at this, is that this is quite normative in the West African tradition, but how does that carry over here to the United States? And then how are the religious lives of enslaved people, particularly Muslims, but broader, to respect, Mohammed, the work that you've put in so far, broader, how is that coming in, how is that perceived by the broader society? And, we look at Nicholas Said from the Civil War, and people say he converted. People look at Omar Ibn Said, and they say he converted. You look at Abdur Rahman, and they say he converted. And it's not as clear cut in that case, in those cases, right? So just thinking about religious identity, religious pluralism, religious belonging, both amongst Muslims and how it's perceived externally by broader US society. Mohammed, you're on mute.
Yeah, really good question. Amongst this isn't always an easy sort of response, because I think what it also unpacks is how we look at orthodoxy, and then also anyone who might be on the margins as well, and also the environment and conditions people are in, quite frankly, the lived experiences, right? So you have this sort of big, and there's a number of scholars, save time, I won't list them, but what I would say to you is that you have sort of the orthodoxy, sort of the blueprint based off of textual knowledge, and then you have lived experience that sometimes are in complementary nature to one another, and sometimes they can be seen as there might be some contradiction. I'll give you a couple of data points. One, and I think the example particularly amongst the discovery, we'll just stay in Maryland since I'm in the DMV, the District of Columbia area. There's burial grounds, right, that have been discovered in Annapolis, and those burial grounds aren't Christian burial grounds. There's a number of individuals who've researched, done the historical work on this. but they're African traditional burial grounds, and which adds into another dynamic, right? Have we even like opened up the role of African traditional religion and also the negotiation, how Muslim communities have engaged with both Islamization, Arabization, how communities adopt and still keep intact those pre-Islamic traditions even within West Africa, and how communities themselves, of course you will have communities who take a much more conservative interpretation, but how some of these communities negotiate of the medicine man incorporated, or wearing a talisman, right? And incorporating, instead of maybe a bird or a leather or some kind of other animal, then maybe the a Quranic passage, etc. But also that even go even further, the negotiation of how communities themselves haven't picked and choose. Again, there's a lot of work that's been done on that. But what I would say to you is that I think that's a whole nother avenue to unpack, because I think for communities themselves and those who live it as a lived experience, and then those who are just studying it from sort of the historical record, there's different feelings and sentiment and how that can be done. And I think there's enough for many researchers to unpack that. The second point that you mentioned, which was absolutely important too as well, is that, you know, what happens, and I think maybe how I interpret it is, you know, sort of what happens next. Like what is this? Where is this for communities who are trying to piece this together? Or sorry, in the religious context, in a broader religious context. And I think what we have is the opportunity for not just Muslim communities, but for religious communities to have much more kind of frank conversations of their family legacy and stories. I'll stop there. I could go
on. Well, I would just add just that the whole story of Omar Ibn Said is a story of religious and cultural pluralism. I know that early on, people thought that he had embraced Christianity because he was observing interfaith and religious pluralism. So I think that gives you one example, but just to reach back to West Africa, the studies that have been done about West African Islam, the scholars really highlight the fact that it was very unique. The West African Islamic tradition is very unique in its pluralism. It was not one where Islam was forced and other traditional African religions were wiped out. That was never a part of, you know, the Islamic West African tradition. And so I think that that thinking of Islam and pluralism is really what we should look at even today when we look at, you know, Muslim communities within the American context, the embracing of pluralism. I think that, you know, the Islamic communities of today, like in particular, Imam Warthadim Muhammad's community, having gone through this transformation to Orthodox Islam, bringing African-American Muslims to Orthodox Islam, he is known for really having to have led and brought the interfaith community to the table around religious pluralism and so forth. And so that's a continued tradition. And I just wanted to add, in addition to what you said, it is not just about religion, but if that's the basis, then your whole society then should reflect pluralism as a whole.
I think that's thank you, Okolo. I think that's a great segue. We've really been talking about these narratives. You know, we started with the individuals talking about narratives, moving into community. Now I think it's time to start talking about the nation. What to recovering these narratives, whether they are written or they are oral or they're some other cultural artifact. You know, we've talked a lot about Sylvia and Diaf's work around music. What does that reveal to us about the United States? How does it help us understand our history or change our understanding of our national history? How does it create different conversations? What are the conversations it can or should create? I'm sort of thinking a little bit more broadly now, maybe a little bit more future oriented. So, Okolo, I'll start with you, please.
I guess as you're asking that question, the first thing that pops in my mind is it kind of reveals a lot of contradiction in the American culture from its onset, its very beginning. I kind of want to refer to this great research and scholarly work that was done by Jeffrey Embolden called Jefferson's Fugitives. It's about the fact, I mean, he just uncovered these narratives, of enslaved Africans who were really escaping captivity in Kentucky. And they actually, they got a letter, 2 letters actually, each one wrote a letter that got to the hands of our president, a sitting president, Thomas Jefferson, asking for his assistance in terms of, their freedom. And these were Muslims, clearly. Jefferson's Quran, Jefferson knew about Islam, he knew about the Arabic, right? And so, but, he really just ignored it. And so, again, as we're establishing as a kind of like the foundation of this country is religious freedom, there's a real big contradiction in that. That's a really stark example of that. And I think all through the history of the enslaved period, clearly, as you mentioned earlier, these names that reflected that you have on your plantation, enslaved Muslims, people that believe, in the one God, and the God of Abraham, that was not recognized. So to me, that's a huge issue and a huge problem. However, as I mentioned earlier, I think we have to move beyond that to look at what these Islamic ideas and the Islamic community and this reconnection of today's Muslims to that West African tradition and to the greater Ummah, is seen in these new Muslim communities like I mentioned Imam Muhammad's community, but there are other Sunni communities that are really building on that same tradition.
Yeah, I think that this idea, particularly when we talk about nation establishment as well, is that it's the same way in the U.S. we have studied the work of de Tocqueville and the influence of democracy in America and the influence of the French on American society and vice versa. I think one also can, or I'll say that I think that in many respects the same thing that one can look at, whether it is acknowledged publicly or not, the role and contribution of Muslims arriving and coming from West Africa. And I think that acknowledgement, whether it's, again, clearly there's debate or less of a debate, and really not the outright sort of acknowledgement outside of the manuscripts that we've seen, is that in fact there is inspiration. I mean, the work of Voltaire and seeing of Mohammed the Prophet. It was a very antagonistic a play that was performed in Baltimore in the late 1700s. The African experience, the African Muslim, is very much part and parcel of the American story and experience. Just as much as we talk about these individuals, and largely men, as our our sister mentioned too as well, and the sort of the patriarchy that has largely been there. These men absolutely were extraordinary, but in many respects, they were ordinary too. And I think that it's very much okay to say that. They paid attention to the schools and the schools that they went to. They listened to their mom. They paid attention to the individual teaching them grammar and logic growing up. And they were able to carry that with them on the journey across shark-infested waters and keep with them intact this level of knowledge consumption and being able to absorb it and inculcate it as part of their everyday life. And so their interaction with others, the prince amongst slaves, et cetera, of course they would be known, because by their character, by their work ethic, it was by their nature to exchange with others. And so I think in many respects, we've only scratched the surface of this broader American history. And I think that these narratives, these stories will come out even more so as we move toward year 3030, who knows, and what that develops. I hope that some young person who's listening now will be inspired, and they will get educational curriculum that will be well balanced and inform them of these stories, and then their inquisitive spirit to go and find more in that quest of research and scholarship. Last thing I'll say to you as well, the work of Wilson, I had to Google because I had forgotten the author's name. Research is Ceremony is one of my favorite books that I've been rereading at least 3 times. It's come out. It's what year did it come out? 2008. And it's a really good, phenomenal body of work of how communities, indigenous communities themselves do research, and its meaning behind the research and building community as well, right? It tells a story, but it's also connected to long histories that they want to keep intact, largely focused in Canada and Australia. But I think this is applicable even within the context that we're talking about right here. What is the research we're developing? What are communities themselves? What are they unpacking? What on what level are the symbols left behind on the manuscripts, and the use of laymen trying to unpack what these mean for communities who are deeply spiritual. And so these are larger questions that I think that we're all trying to wrestle through, I think, as a community, as a nation too, as well. Absolutely, at best, influenced just by the environment, and at a possibility, our founding fathers taking real purposeful notes because of the inspiration of what they provided.
Thank you. I thank you both for this conversation. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. It's amazing to me that we started talking about individual narratives and questions of literacy and expanding from there towards a history and towards a future, from the individual to community, the community building up all the way to the concept of the nation, and then coming back down to the individual. I love these interplays and these intersections, and the fact that it's all about asking this question is, what do we learn by what we have, and how do we find out more to ask different and better questions?
Mm-hmm.
And I love that growth. I love that potential. For me, this is always the best conversations. Not that you come to a resolution, but you come to saying, and now what's next?
Yeah.
On that note, we do have to end this conversation. I want to thank you both for your time this evening. I want to thank the audience for their time this evening. I want to thank the Spoleto Festival and Miss Letitia Smith for organizing this and having us here this evening. I would like to remind everybody that there is another event coming in January of 2022, on January 18th. The next discussion will be about the Crusades from a variety of different perspectives and notions of holy war more broadly. So we invite you to join us there as well. Again, thank you both, Mohammed and Okolo, for your time this evening. Round of applause to you both and the time and the knowledge you've given us. And God willing, we'll be able to meet and do it again soon and in person. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hussein.
Thank you very much.